Thank you for joining us today. We're hosting a series of short webinars in place of our annual Mesothelioma and asbestos-related lung cancer study day. I'm joined today by Alison McCormick, who's kindly agreed to speak. She is a barrister at Outer Temple Chambers, and she has a wealth of experience representing mesothelioma and lung cancer patients and their families. She is also assistant coroner for Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Hertfordshire. So I will pass over to Alison. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to talk to us today, thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Hello, everybody. I'm hoping to give you an insight into the world of the coroner today. And I'm going to start off with a few statistics taken from the Chief Coroner's annual report of 2017-2018. In that year, in England and Wales, there were 500,000 deaths. And of those 500,000 deaths, 229,700 were reported to the coroner. So conventionally, about 45% of deaths are reported to the coroner. In Berkshire, where I spend most of my time, we have about 2,000 deaths per year reported to the coroner's office. Of those 229,700 deaths in 1718, 31,519 went to inquest. So about 14% of reported deaths go to inquest. And that is in fact a much higher percentage than in most jurisdictions. In terms of industrial disease conclusions made up about 10% of the inquests in 1718. And so they account for about 1.4% of all reported deaths. So as you can see, a very small amount of the work that the coroner's office does. Let me turn now to a little history. The office of the coroner, as it operates in the current English legal system, is virtually unique. And although there are people called coroners in other jurisdictions, they generally operate more like forensic scientists. So think Amelia Fox in Silent Witness. That's not me. I'm not medically qualified. I'm a lawyer, as are all coroners who work in the English legal system. The coroner in Scotland is called the Procurator Fiscal. So again, in Scotland, they have a different system. The coroner has been around in the English legal system since the reign of Richard I in 1194. And from that time on, the coroner was responsible for examining sudden deaths. In medieval times, the way of things used to be that if somebody found a deceased body, then they would raise what was called a hue and cry. That's where the phrase comes from. And that would bring the body to the attention of the coroner. The coroner would then ride out and examine the body and call together a group of free men and hold an inquest. Things are a little different now. I don't have any hue and cry. I generally get a ping on my inbox, and I don't ride out. I usually catch the 7:34 to Reading. In terms of legislation, the role of the coroner is defined by statute, and the legislation that we work under today is called the Coroners and Justice Act 2009. That statute is supported by various rules and regulations. The coroner is a lawyer, as I've said, and an independent office holder. We are paid by the local authority because they have an obligation to provide a coronial service, but we're not employed by them so that we can retain our independence, which is obviously a very important part of our function. The role of a coroner is definitely not a 9 till 5 job. It's a 24/7 job. We operate out of hours, and we operate to deal with things like organ donation, which is obviously time critical. We are required to assist with the paperwork to repatriate bodies abroad. And so again, that doesn't happen just in the weekdays. And we're frequently called by the police where they're investigating suspicious deaths. So we offer a round-the-clock service. So what triggers a coronial investigation? Well, a coronial investigation is triggered when a coroner is made aware of a body within their jurisdiction and there is reason to suspect that the person has died an unnatural death, or the cause of death isn't known, or the person is thought to have died in custody or in state detention. The referrals to the coroner come from police, from doctors, both general practitioners and hospital doctors, from registrars and from organisations such as the CQC. As I said, in Berkshire, we get about 2,000 referrals every year. The notification of death regulations governs the circumstances in which referrals have to be made to the coroner, and that includes where a medical practitioner suspects that someone has died from an injury or disease attributable to any employment held by that person during the course of that person's lifetime. Moving on now to consider postmortems. In the year 2017-2018, nationally, 37% of referrals to the coroner's office resulted in there being a post-mortem, although it does vary very much by area. In terms of post-mortem, it's not a one-size-fits-all process. There are different kinds of post-mortem, and we do try to do the least invasive post-mortem possible for a particular case. So there are some occasions where we can just scan the body. There are some occasions where we can have simply an external post-mortem. Sometimes in police cases, it's necessary to have a more detailed forensic post-mortem, but we do what is necessary for the particular case. There are also cases where general practitioners and hospital doctors will refer a case to the coroner, but offer a natural cause of death. If we can accept that natural cause of death, then we can close the case with a form that we call a Form 100A. If somebody has a post-mortem and the pathologist returns a natural cause of death, then again, we can close the case, and then we close it with what we call a Form 100B. However, if the post-mortem returns an unnatural cause of death, or if the referring doctor gives us a unnatural cause of death which we accept without post-mortem, then at that point in time, we have to move on to an inquest. In terms of the cause of death, that's something that unusually causes real problems sometimes for doctors in terms of how you formulate that cause of death. In part 1 of the cause of death, that should list the immediate disease or condition leading directly to death. So, for example, it could say 1A, myocardial infarction. It shouldn't be a mode of dying. It shouldn't be cardiac arrest or heart attack. 1A should be followed by any other disease which led to the immediate cause of death, such as coronary atheroma in the case of myocardial infarction. In part 2 of the cause of death should be other significant conditions which have contributed to death but are not related to the disease or condition which causes the death. So it shouldn't include every single thing that that person has suffered from in their lifetime, only those things which are thought to have caused or contributed to the death. If a case moves to an inquest, then the way that inquest works is that it's initially opened by way of a very short administrative hearing that's held in open court. There may then be a pre-inquest review. That doesn't happen in most cases, only in the most complex ones. And after that pre-inquest review, which is a bit like a case management hearing, then we would move to inquest. Most inquests are heard by coroners alone, although there are some inquests which require a jury. Most industrial disease inquests are heard by a coroner alone. The parties to an inquest are called interested persons, and the categories of interested persons are set out in the statute, and that includes the family of the deceased person and their personal representatives. It can also include a person who by their act or omission may have caused or contributed to the death of the deceased. And it can also include somebody who's offered life insurance to the deceased. The inquest has a very specific purpose and remit, and that again is also set out in the statute. And the job of the coroner is essentially to answer 4 statutory questions. Those questions are: who died, where they died, when they died, and how they died. How essentially means by what means, and nothing more broadly than that. The coroner also has to decide on the correct medical cause of death, and at the end of the inquest, the coroner has to reach what we call a conclusion. It used to be called a verdict, but now it's called a conclusion. It's really important to remember that an inquest is a fact-finding inquiry. So it's not a trial in any sense of the word. Nobody is on trial in a coroner's court. And also it's not a public inquiry. It has, as I've said, a very, very specific and narrow purpose and remit. In terms of conclusions, these can generally be either short form or narrative. The guidance is that coroners should always try to return short form conclusions when they can, because those are more helpful for statistical reasons and also they're easily understood. So short form conclusions can include things like accident, suicide, drug-related death, alcohol-related death, road traffic collision. It can include natural causes, and it can include industrial disease, or lawful or unlawful killing. And there are also some times where coroners return what's called an open short form conclusion. For industrial diseases, in common with most short form conclusions, the standard of proof that the coroner works to is on the balance of probability, which means that something is more likely than not. Only the conclusion of unlawful killing has a higher standard of proof, which is beyond reasonable doubt. An open conclusion has no standard of proof at all, and that is a fallback conclusion when the standard of proof required for all other conclusions is not fulfilled. The coroner can, as I've said, if he or she doesn't want to return a short form conclusion, can return a narrative conclusion, which is simply 1 or 2 sentences which set out the conclusion of the coroner in a very brief, neutral and factual way. Generally, we try to, and we're encouraged to deal with inquests within 6 months of somebody dying, but unfortunately it's not always possible to do that, and particularly at the moment in the current pandemic, most coroners have quite a significant backlog. Dealing finally with a few relevant points for industrial disease cases, all cases where there's reason to suspect that somebody has died from an industrial disease should be reported to the coroner. Industrial disease is not defined in the Act, and it doesn't have any kind of refined meaning. It isn't necessary for someone to have suffered from a prescribed disease or to have been employed in a prescribed employment. The family and personal representatives of the person who's passed away will be interested parties in the inquest. In terms of post-mortem, generally in mesothelioma cases, if there has been a diagnosis in life and that diagnosis has been done with the benefit of a biopsy, then I do not require a post-mortem. I simply rely upon the clinic letters in order to satisfy myself that that person has indeed contracted and passed away from mesothelioma. However, if there is no in-life diagnosis, or if the diagnosis is woolly and isn't backed up by a biopsy, then in that scenario, I would generally ask for a post-mortem with whatever histology the pathologist thought was appropriate. I do always listen to whatever families think about the situation before deciding upon whether a post-mortem is necessary, but ultimately it's the decision of the coroner as to whether it is or is not necessary in an individual case. In terms of the evidence that's heard at an industrial disease type inquest, generally it will comprise of summary general practitioner records, either a cause of death letter or a post-mortem report, an in-life statement from the deceased setting out exposure to asbestos, for example, or sometimes a statement from family setting out what they know about that exposure. Generally, there might be reference to the person's medical records and to the clinic records that support the diagnosis, and also to any HMRC employment records which help to shed light on any exposure to asbestos. Most industrial disease inquests are in fact held on paper, and the coroner will simply read out the evidence rather than actually having to hear from witnesses live. Generally speaking, I, in common with most coroners, won't mention the name of any exposing employer at the inquest, and that's to avoid them having to become an interested party. Generally speaking, at an industrial disease inquest, it will only be the coroner and the family, or the coroner and the personal representatives of the person who's passed away. Families shouldn't require legal representation at an industrial disease inquest, although some people do choose to have that, but it shouldn't be necessary. And as I've said, it's not necessary for the person to have worked in any particular type of employment, or to have had any particular exposure to a specific substance. The term industrial disease is very broad, although it must be of a type which is occupationally induced, and the disease must have caused or contributed to the person's death. So that pretty much deals with all of the things that I wanted to talk about. But I did finally want to reassure you that whilst we fully appreciate that people have to come to the coroner's service at a time when they're going through terrible tragedy and understandable bereavement and grief, we do try to offer a really personal service. We try not to make it scary or intimidating. And if you are dealing with the coroner's office, please do call us or email us. Don't feel that you have to sit and suffer in silence. Even if you think you've got a silly question, it won't be a silly question. So do please feel free. I've worked with a number of really experienced and very helpful coroner's officers who are only too willing to answer any questions that anybody may have. And finally, there is a booklet, and it was reproduced in the early part of this year. It's called A Guide to Coroner Services for Bereaved People, and it's produced by the MOJ. It's in hard copy and it's also online, and it's a really useful explanation about the coroner's service. It's in easy language, it's accurate, and it's very informative and easy to use. And so again, that's something that I'd recommend to everybody. And as I say, you can either get hold of hard copies from the MOJ, or you can access it online. So I hope you've all found that a very helpful insight into the sort of work that we do.
Well, thank you very much, Alison. That was certainly really helpful and informative, and I think it will provide some reassurance to some of the people probably listening to your presentation, that it's that you do try to provide not just a personal service, but also about that a post-mortem is not necessarily automatic, that you know, if there's a lifetime biopsy that's conclusive, then you know that will be good enough.
Yes,
so I guess
in most of the cases that we have, diagnostics are so good these days that often it is the case that there has been an in-life biopsy.
Yeah, fantastic. I've just got one question for you from one of our attendees, if that's okay. And that is, what impacts, if any, has COVID-19 had on postmortems and inquests in general?
Yes, well, as I said in the talk, at the moment, it's had a very significant impact on our backlog of cases, because we haven't been able to sit in open court, which we're required to do, and we haven't been able to hold all the inquests that we would have hoped to have held over the last several months. So we've all got a backlog, and so again, we apologise for that, but people are finding a bit of a delay. Specifically in terms of postmortems, we've had to work very carefully with our pathologists to make sure everybody is safe. And we are still carrying out postmortems. The pathologists are using full and appropriate PPE to do those postmortems. And so what we've also done is we've got a set of questions that when someone passes away, the coroner's officer will ask the family a series of questions that are intended to elicit whether we think that there's a chance that the person may have been COVID-19 positive, so that we can pass that on to the pathologist. And it may be that the pathologist then decides perhaps to delay the post-mortem for a little while, or to do it in a different way. But we ask those questions so that we can keep everybody safe. But we are working so that we can do those post-mortems that we think are necessary.
Okay, that's great. So effectively it's carrying on as normal, just adapting what's been done.
Yes, absolutely, and we're very very much open for business. We're just having to operate in a little bit of a different way.
Well, thank you very much. Many thanks, Alison, for sharing your experiences and your time today. Really helpful and informative talk. Many thanks.
Many thanks. Thank you.